Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular series of Shiurim and Halacha. Our topic is astrology and the attitudes of the great rabbis towards astrology through the generations. What we have seen up till this point are plenty of examples of great rabbis who not only embraced the truth and validity of astrology, although they disagreed among themselves about the exact methodology, but they were themselves astrologers. Then we saw those great rabbis who not only rejected the truth and validity of astrology, but held that it was not only prohibited, but worse than prohibited. Belief in astrology, the Rambam said, was largely responsible for the destruction of the Second Temple. I mean, that's how bad it is, worse than just prohibited. Given these two poles, those who embraced astrology and those who rejected it, we then, last week, began looking at the opinion of the Meiri, and we're going to pick up again today with the opinion of the Meiri. It's fairly long, and we're going to get through all of it today. We began looking last time at the opinion of the Meiri, who takes a middle path on this position. Let's see if we can get his text beautifully on the screen here. Okay, we're in the middle of the text of the Meiri, but before we pick up the text again, let's just look quickly at the passage in the Gemara which the Meiri referred us to. He didn't quote it. That's why I put it in brackets on the screen, because this is not really in the text of the Meiri. He just refers to this Gemara, assuming you're familiar with it. And you remember we saw this last time. From Rabbi Akiva, we learn that the Jews are not subject to the influence of the stars. How do we know that? Because Rabbi Akiva had a daughter. The astrologers said to Rabbi Akiva, on the day that your daughter gets married, a snake is going to bite her and she is going to die. Now, Rabbi Akiva was quite upset about that. This disturbed him greatly. On that day, when she was getting married, the night before the marriage, she took the hairpin out of her hair, and before going to sleep, she stuck the hairpin into the wall to keep it there. And the next morning, she'd put it back in her hair. She just happened to stick the hairpin into the eye of the snake. In the morning, when she woke up and took the hairpin off the wall to put back into her hair, she saw that she took the whole snake out with it. The whole snake was still attached to the hairpin, and her life was saved. Her father, Rabbi Akiva, asked her, "What did you do to merit the salvation? What did you do to merit not being killed by the influence of the stars?" She explained, "Last night a poor person came begging at the door. Everyone was busy preparing the wedding meal, and no one except me heard the beggar knocking at the door. I went to the door, and I brought him the food, which was my dinner, and I gave it to the poor person." Her father, Rabbi Akiva, said to her, "That was a great mitzvah. That was a great act of chesed, compassion." And then Rabbi Akiva went out to the public and explained to the public, "Tzedakah tatzil memavet," giving charity is a great mitzvah, in the merit of which you can be saved from death. Well, that's the whole story in the Gemara. Now, let's pick up with the analysis of the story in the words of the Meiri. The Meiri says, Here we go. No, this is not it. The Meiri says, here we are. Okay. The Meiri says as follows. These are the words of the Meiri. The Gemara tells us that when Rabbi Akiva heard the prediction of the astrologers, Rabbi Akiva, was very upset and very bothered by that. It bothered him immensely. He was very nervous because of the prediction of the astrologers. Alma, from this we conclude shemutar lachush. From this we conclude that it's correct, it's proper, it is permitted. There's nothing wrong with being concerned. There's nothing wrong with worrying about the predictions of the astrologers. Rabbi Akiva himself maybe did not consult the astrologers, but when he heard what the astrologers said about his daughter, he was very nervous about that. He worried about it greatly. Well, some people say we learn from Rabbi Akiva that it's okay to accept the words of the astrologers. Eini mevin rayatam. But I, the Meiri says, do not understand this conclusion. I do not see that this conclusion truly flows from the text. Because if you look at the whole story, you see that Rabbi Akiva lifted not a finger to prevent his daughter from getting married. If he took the prediction of the astrologers seriously, why did he allow his daughter to get married? This is back in the old days, like when all was right with society, before the ruination of modern times. Back then, when all was right with society, and parents decided when their children are getting married, when parents decided who their children are going to be married to, when these decisions were all in the hands of the parents, all Rabbi Akiva had to say to save his daughter's life was, we're not letting her get married. Well, he lifted not a finger to prevent the marriage. Not only that, he gave his blessing to the marriage. He approved the marriage. Back in those days, there was no such thing as a marriage, unless the parents on both sides agreed to it. Well, you see, from the fact that Rabbi Akiva agreed to allow his daughter to be married and gave his blessing to that marriage, you see that he wasn't so concerned about the prediction of these astrologers. It didn't bother him so much. Ella, rather, shehem matirim af al she'ela sheharei amru, the incorrect understanding of the story leads to the conclusion that it's correct to ask the astrologers for advice. But that's not truly part of the story, because in the story in the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva never asked the astrologers for advice. They came and told him. And therefore, one surely cannot conclude from this story that it's correct to ask the astrologers for advice. Haiman de Misyalid B'Shaplonis, Ganav Yehei, Gazlan Yehei, V'chein Harbe. There are plenty of examples of predictions made by the astrologers on the basis of the position of the celestial bodies. There's not a hint in this story that it's correct to approach the astrologers and ask them. Lo hodiu davar zeh ela she'adam matmid lahachriach tivo lishanot et tafkido hatlatov. All of the astrological passages in the Gemara, and when we began this series of Shiurim, we went through a number of those passages in the Gemara, which make explicitly clear that people born under certain astral influences will tend to be thieves. People born under other astral influences will tend to be murderers, and so forth and so on. We saw all of those examples, well, many of those examples in the Gemara. Those passages in the Gemara are simply intended to teach you that you have to work as hard as you can to be a good person. Everyone has born within him, everyone has inborn tendencies to do bad things. We all have a yetzer hara. We all have a bad tendency within us. And all of us are engaged in the battle against our worst elements, against the worst elements of our personalities. We all must try to overcome the bad elements in our own personalities. And the whole purpose of the Gemara, when it told us that so-and-so has a tendency to be a murderer and so-and-so has a tendency to be a thief, well, everyone has to try to overcome his or her Yetzer Hara. And the Gemara gave us these examples only to strengthen our resolve, in the battle against the bad tendencies which we naturally have within us. But no one ever said in the Gemara that it's correct to consult the astrologers. No one ever said that it's correct to approach them and ask them for advice. Af mizo ein ra'aya etzli, sheharei hoda'azo ein ela lahachriach tivo. Well, all you can prove from the Gemara is that the predictions of astrology might be useful, might be beneficial. The predictions of astrology might be good in aiding us in the battle against our evil inclination. Ein ze ela k'mishu yotze leda im hu cham b'tivo k'dei sheyargil atzmo b'dvarim karim l'matza alav et atchum. Back in those days, medicine was not exactly the same as modern medicine. Much of the wisdom of medicine in the late antiquity and the Middle Ages has been lost. Medicine back in those days revolved largely around the question of whether an individual's body is by nature hot or by nature cold. Many different characteristics of the bodies, human body. Different people have different physical characteristics in their bodies, and those who tend to be hot by nature, of course, should be advised by the physician to eat and drink cool things. Those who by their nature tends to be too cool in their body will be advised by the physician to eat and drink hot things, and so forth and so on. Just as in medicine, it's important to know what the nature of your body is so that you can combat that and bring your body into equilibrium the way it should be, rather like the modern physician might say, based on your blood tests, your lipid profile is too high. You have too much fat circulating in your blood. The way to be healthy is to consume less fat. Well, back in those days, they had other criteria which they use, hot and cold. Well, sof divreihem, the bottom line, all astrology can do for us, Shehochmat HaKaldiyim, the Hochma, the wisdom of the astrologers, Eina Hochmat Kochavim Levad, the wisdom of the astrologers is not only astronomy, to explain to us the positions of the astral bodies, the celestial bodies, Ella Shenit Arva Imahem Meleches Kishuf, Shehochmes HaKochavim, Eina Yechola Lehodia Pratei Adorim. The horrible truth is that although there is indeed an element of truth in astrology, the horrible truth is, mixed in with the wisdom of astrology is a lot of magical nonsense. Since there's a lot of magical nonsense which is mixed in with the wisdom of astrology, we have a problem. We have no way of knowing exactly which elements in the wisdom of astrology are true and valid, and which are the nonsensical elements which got added in by silly magicians in the course of the generations. Shim yodei mederech kochavim shezeh ha'ish yatzliach Yekneh Sadot V'Kramim, if the position of the stars indicate that a specific person will be successful in business, will buy fields and vineyards, lo yodea sheyekneh meploni. Even if the stars correctly predict that so-and-so will be a successful realtor, successful in real estate business, the stars cannot predict from whom this individual is going to buy the fields. The stars might correctly predict that he will be rich and buy fields and vineyards, but from whom he is going to buy the fields and vineyards, that the stars surely cannot tell us. Chaldeim hayu omrim, the astrologers say, kul hu nichsach Yosef mokeh shalbei acheluhu. The astrologers say as follows, and now he mentions another story from the Gemara, which he assumes you're familiar with. And this one you probably are familiar with, so I'll just run through the story very quickly. It's a very well-known story from the Gemara, and then we'll understand why he's quoting it at this point. The story in the Gemara is as follows. There was a Jew by the name of Yosef. Yosef was Mokir Shabbat. Yosef honored the Sabbath day very much. He was a poor man, but he spent all the money he could, and he spent as much as he could afford to buy things in honor of Shabbat. And indeed, every Friday, he would go to the fish market and spend a lot of money for a nice big fish to take home for his wife to cook in honor of the Shabbat. He was a poor man, but he did what he could to honor Shabbat. Wow. Well, the poets, the rich Gentile who lived in town, consulted the astrologers, and the astrologers told the rich Gentile, beware, Yosef, the Jew who honors the Sabbath, is going to consume all of your wealth. You're going to lose all of your wealth to that Jew. That's what the astrologers told the wealthy Gentile. Well, the wealthy Gentile was quite nervous about this and quite upset. He sold all his property and bought with the proceeds a precious jewel, which he bound up in his hat, so he was able to walk around with all of his wealth with him, thereby protecting all his wealth, hoping to make it impossible for Yosef, the Jew, to acquire all his wealth from him. One happy day, the non-Jewish wealthy man with the jewel in his hat was walking across the bridge. There was a strong gust of wind. The wind blew the hat off of his head. The jewel fell into the water under the bridge. The fish came and ate the jewel. The fish was eventually caught by the fishermen and came to market. Yosef arrived at the market on Friday to buy his customary fish for Shabbat. That's the fish which he bought. He brought the fish home. His wife opened it up to clean the fish and prepare it for Shabbat, and discovered the precious jewel. And it turns out that the prediction of the astrologers was correct. Yosef did acquire all of the wealth of that non-Jew, and it happened in this roundabout, complicated way. Now, according to the Meiri, there is an element of truth in the wisdom of astrology. Unfortunately, it gets mixed in with a lot of stuff which is really not legitimately part of the wisdom of astrology. That the influence of the stars will tend to make you rich, or will tend to make you poor, that might well be true. But exactly how it's going to happen and the mechanisms by which it's going to happen, that the stars surely cannot tell you. The Meiri then goes on one step further. Hayu lehem be'inyinei kochavim shehayu ma'aminei sheruach nevuah ba lehem. Some of those astrologers are so haughty, Some of those astrologers are so prideful, some of those astrologers have such a high impression of themselves, they think that their wisdom, they think that their astrological wisdom has granted them the power of nevuah, the power of prophecy. We know that it's only a real prophet who has been inspired directly by God. We know that it's only a real prophet like Yeshayahu or Yechezkel. We know that it's only a true prophet who can predict the future without error, who knows definitively what's going to happen in the future. Ordinary citizens like you and me, who are not real prophets, are unable to predict the future without error, and therefore it is impossible for mere astrologers, who are surely not prophets. They might think of themselves as being prophets, but they aren't. It's impossible for mere astrologers. They are mere citizens like you and me. They have not been granted the inspiration of prophecy like the great prophets of biblical times. They cannot unerringly predict the future, rather like a modern meteorologist, like a modern weatherman, who might be able to predict what the tendencies of the weather are tomorrow. But we all know that they make a lot of mistakes because they're not really prophets. And, this is outside of Harry Potter, right? In Harry Potter, let's forget about that. But our meteorologists who predict weather, of course, make mistakes. And astrologers are no better than that. They were not granted the gift of prophecy. Osim lahem slamim la'ovdam. Many of those astrologers are actually idol worshippers who undergo certain mystical rituals. They venerate certain signs, they make certain offerings, they pray to certain stars. Many of those astrologers undertake mystical, idolatrous procedures, methodologies, which lead them to believe that they're able to predict the future. But that's just nonsense. Only a real prophet can predict the future unerringly, without mistake. That's one big problem with many of those astrologers. Yesh katacheret, there are other astrologers who have other problems with their thinking. Hem hanikraim mezile kochot. There are other prophets, there are other astrologers who talk about astral influences. There are other astrologers who talk endlessly about the influence of the celestial bodies on life down here on Earth. Hayu maktirim le'eze kochav b'shot yiduot. At certain times of the day, they would do certain rituals to appease certain celestial bodies. They're also engaged in some form of idolatry. Hayu mizilim behem koach hakochav lagid atidot. They thought that they were calling upon the stars to influence them with the power of predicting the future. That's another group of astrologers out there who are asking the stars, beseeching the stars, trying to influence the stars in order to acquire the ability to predict the future. Well, these two groups of astrologers, Elu Shnayim, these two groups are absolute, complete avodah zarah, idolatry, and we have nothing to do with them. If they are venerating the stars, seeking the power of prophecy, or if they are engaging in any form of veneration or praise of the stars, hoping for the power of prophecy to be granted to them, well, that's largely what avodah zarah, what idolatry is all about. And of course, We want nothing to do with that. So, as today, with many mystical movements out there in the contemporary world, many mystical movements out there might have elements of truth in them, but if the mystical movement is bound up with idolatrous procedures, well, we of course want nothing to do with that. And if the mystical movement if part of the mystical movement claims to be that they're granted granted the power of prophecy, knowing what's going to happen, well, that's simply impossible. Only a true prophet is able to predict what will happen. Anyone else, you and I, ordinary citizens, might be able to figure out what probably will happen, what the tendencies of nature are, but true prediction is limited to true prophets. Well, those are the first two categories of astrologers who are dismissed entirely, rejected entirely, because they are bound up with idolatry. There's a third category of astrologers out there. Right? He wrote this in the Middle Ages. Chokrim al kochavim mevukashim lehem al sedem halach nimtza lehem. Some of the astrologers are studying very carefully the paths of the celestial bodies. V'neged eze tzura shebegalgal hashmini hem sovavot. And if you understand the theory of a little bit of the theory of astrology as it existed in pre-Galilean times, before Galileo, back in those days, before Galileo, it was believed, maybe it's even true, that the Earth is the center of the universe, and the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars, all the celestial bodies are embedded in crystal spheres which rotate around the Earth. Rotating around the Earth are concentric crystal spheres, 8 of them, and in the different spheres are embedded different celestial bodies. And if you understand the way the spheres are rotating, and if you understand which celestial bodies are embedded where, in which spheres, then of course you know how the spheres are going to continue rotating, and you know what the position of the stars is going to be tomorrow. And then this theory of astrology, which was more or less universally accepted, well, at least in the Near East and Europe, I don't know about other parts of the world, this theory of astrology, which is more or less universally accepted in pre-modern Europe and the Near East up to the times of Galileo, not only among Jews, but more or less universally accepted, assumes the existence of these crystal spheres and the celestial bodies being embedded in them. And indeed, they were able, through very complicated calculations, very complicated calculations, they were able to correctly predict the positions of the celestial bodies tomorrow, the day after, next month, and next year, because in truth, in point of fact, the celestial bodies do move in a very orderly fashion. They might not have had exactly the correct explanation for why the celestial bodies move in an orderly fashion, but the complicated theory which they developed did successfully predict the movement of the celestial bodies. Now, we have much simpler, even the much simpler ways that we use to explain the orbits of the planets. Today, the orbits of the planets are explained as being ellipses. Right? An ellipse is like an oval, right? A squared plus b squared equals a constant. X squared plus y squared equals a constant is the basic form, algebraic expression of an ellipse. And calculating the movement of a planet along an ellipse is child's play compared to the complicated calculations which existed before Galileo's times. But even today, Even today, when the algebraic formula, the mathematical formula that explains the movement of the moon around the Earth, which is a formula basically of the form x squared plus y squared equals a constant. That's the basic form of the ellipse. Very simple formula to work with, but it's not quite so simple because there are many correction factors involved. Think about it. As the moon moves around the Earth, the gravitational force of the moon attracts the water from the oceans. The oceans rise towards the moon. As the moon moves away, the oceans sink back down again. That's our tides are all linked directly to the movement of the moon because of the gravitational force of the moon. And all this can be calculated fairly precisely. But think about it for a moment. As the tides rise and fall in the oceans, as the tides rise and fall in the oceans, the location of the exact center of the Earth changes. The location of the center of the Earth is changing from minute to minute as the seas rise and fall on different places on the Earth. Of course, the Earth doesn't have exactly one center; it has two centers. Ellipses have two centers, not one center. But not only is the center of gravity constantly in motion, but there are a ton of other factors which are constantly in flux, constantly changing. Anyone who wants to get a PhD in astronomy nowadays, in celestial mechanics, anyone who wants a PhD in astronomy can work long and hard, and if you can figure out another small correction factor to explain the movement of the orbit of the moon, then that's a good PhD product. At the moment, there are around 50 known correction factors which must be added to the basic formula for predicting the movement of the moon, and new correction factors are constantly being discovered. Bottom line, back in those days, the astrologers who had, according to their understanding, which worked, I mean, their understanding was successful and worked in predicting the movement of the stars. Those who studied that had true knowledge. They had the ability to correctly predict which celestial bodies would be where at what time of the day for any period in the future. Osim tsurot b'sha'ot yiduot shayu kochav mevukash lahem sovev keneged atzura, and they would make drawings to remind themselves of which stars would be in which locations. Uvitzad shehi tzefoni or zomi, they would make notations about exactly how many degrees north or how many degrees south a specific star would appear at a specific time. Hayu osim tzura kamoa me'achad memine hamatachot shayu ra'uila. And they used to make models out of metal. They used to make models of the celestial bodies, and with the models, they could make the models move in a way very similar to the stars' actual motion in the sky. Im zahav, im kesef, they made their models out of gold and silver. Yachadim otam l'choliyim yiduim, and then the astrologers made the following step. They said that certain diseases are under the influence of certain celestial positions, and they came to and they came to associate specific diseases with specific positions of specific stars in the firmament. Well, those astrologers are attempting to develop a scientific understanding of the way diseases work. And we might agree with them, we might disagree with them, but they were doing their best to have a rational understanding of the way things work in this world. The next group of astrologers, Yigzeru Malotechem Eze Et Ra'ui Lokot Zra'im, the next group of astrologers would try to tell us, based on the position of the stars, when is the best time to harvest grains, when is the best time to harvest other crops. Ve'im nilkatu b'yom hahu b'sha'ahi ma yo'ilu ve'ech yo'ilu. They try to tell us exactly which days and which time of the day to harvest this kind of crop or that kind of crop. Well, kol elu, all of these astrologers mentioned so far, Hem bivadai b'chlal ha'isur, are surely included in the prohibitive group. The reason that all of these astrologers so far are in the prohibited group is either because they're false prophets, or even if they're trying to rationally, scientifically predict what's going to happen in the future, they are so often wrong that one cannot rely upon them. And if they present their predictions as being the inevitable result of the position of the stars, they are simply lying, because it is impossible to make unerring predictions based upon the positions of the stars. And anyone who tries to do so is in the prohibited group, either because he's a false prophet, or because she's an idolater, or because he or she is simply lying. Now we go one step further. This is the Iker. This is the main point to remember. Hagalgalim v'amazalot, the spheres which surround the earth, in which the celestial bodies are embedded, and the mazalot, the constellations which are embedded in them. Yeah, the Farmer's Almanac is a very fine example of exactly what he says is prohibited. Right? Today, the Yenan, what's the Yenan in English? The wine master. Well, one of the jobs of the wine master today here in Israel, vineyards, viticulture, growing grapes is big business here in Israel today, like in many places in the world. And the wine master is the man or the woman who has been trained, among other things, among the many things that the wine master must know how to do, is go out into the vineyard every day, taste the grapes as they are growing every day, and the wine master will decide, based on tasting the grapes every day, you want to harvest the grapes when they are fully ripe. You don't want to wait longer than that, because then they'll become overripe. There's one point in time where those grapes are going to be ideal for making wine, and it's the job of the wine master to determine that every day as the grapes come to ripeness. He'll go out into the vineyards, and several times a day he'll taste the grapes. He'll go from vine to vine and taste the grapes, and when they are exactly perfect, he'll say, now we harvest the grapes as quickly as possible. This is the moment. Well, he's basing his decision not upon the position of the stars, which is inevitably fallible. You can't follow the Farmer's Almanac, because it's impossible to predict what day the grapes are going to be perfectly ripe, perfectly ready. The only way to do that is by tasting them regularly. The same could be said of any other harvest. In harvesting wheat, here in Israel, there's not a lot of wheat grown. Actually, very little of wheat is grown in Israel. Almost all of our wheat is imported nowadays. But where wheat is grown in Israel, if you know anything about weather in Israel, one thing you have to know is that in the summer, it does not rain. Summer is a dry season in Israel. It does not rain in the summer. If you want to plan an outdoor wedding in the summer, go ahead and do it. It's not going to rain. You don't have to have tents ready as a precaution if it rains on your wedding in the summer. It doesn't rain in the summer in Israel. But other places in the world where the weather does not behave so well, in Europe and North America, where the weather behaves very unpredictably, it rains in those places in the summer. And in harvesting the wheat crop, the farmer has a big problem. Of course, he doesn't want to harvest his wheat before it's ripe. You have to wait until it's ripe. On the other hand, if you wait until it's ripe and you wait an extra few hours, you wait an extra day, maybe it's going to start to rain. If it starts to rain and the wheat gets wet while it is ripe, if it doesn't dry out pretty quick within a few hours, that wheat is going to begin to rot. It's going to rot on the stalks, and you're going to lose the whole crop. Timing the moment of harvest is a very delicate matter in growing wheat. Well, in Israel, it doesn't matter so much because it doesn't rain here. But in those places where it does rain in the summer, the timing of the harvest must be very precise. If you live in farming areas, you live in the Midwest of the United States, or you live in the Po Valley in Italy, if you live in the places where there's large agriculture, the hourly news broadcasts on the radio begin with the weather forecast. I mean, that's the most important thing for the farmers. They begin with lengthy, detailed weather forecasts, and then they get to the world news, unlike us city slickers who are accustomed to having the weather forecast just tacked on at the end of the news. That's the least important thing that they're going to tell us. Well, the position of the celestial bodies, according to the Meiri, Po'alim, do have an effect. The position of the celestial bodies does have an effect, b'nivra'ot hatachtonim, on all of the things which were created down here on this earth. The position of the stars does indeed influence life down here on earth. Kama amaram, and this must be true, because the rabbis said in the Midrash, Ein lecha kol esev ve'esev milamata, there is not a single blade of grass on this earth, she'ein lo kolchav milamala, which is uninfluenced by a star in the heavens. Makeh oto ve'omer lo gadel, the influence of the star strikes the blade of grass and makes it grow. That's what the Midrash says. Every blade of grass in this world is under the influence of the star. If that's true about every blade of grass, all the more so it's true about everything else. Everything else in this world, everything in this world is under the influence of the stars. Kol shadavar kavua b'chach, any issue which is determined by the stars, kagon, for example, Shezeh hamazal moshel biyom ploni b'makam ploni. For example, things which are established by the stars that a certain constellation dominates on a certain hour of a certain day, a certain hour of a certain day of the week, where the certain constellation dominates. Levana b'chidusha mosefet b'mayim u'melachlechet haaretz. It's well established that the moon, one of the celestial bodies, the moon, has influence over the oceans. We see it with our own eyes. The tides rise. When the moon is overhead, we see with our own eyes that the moon has the position of the moon has influence over the seas, over the waters of the world. All the waters of the world rise towards the moon when the moon is overhead. Ad shegoremet hefsed behituch ha'etz hanechtach ba'ota sha'a. If you chop off the branch of a tree while the moon is directly overhead, the tree is going to bleed much more. If you cut off a branch of a tree, the sap oozes out. farmers who are going to prune trees are, of course, very interested in pruning the tree at the correct time when the tree is not going to bleed, is not going to ooze too much sap. You don't want to destroy the tree by pruning off a branch. If you have to prune a branch, you prune the branch when the tree is not going to lose too much sap. When the moon is directly overhead, it's going to draw the fluid up from the roots, and that's not the time to prune the tree. Every farmer knows that. Ein bazeh klum. People who say this are not engaged in any magical talk. People who say this are not engaged in nonsense. Hu kedavar miteva. This is a fact of nature. It's a simple fact of nature. This is the way God created the world, that when the moon is overhead, all the fluids of the world rise towards it. We see this with our own eyes. It's a simple fact of nature. No nonsense about that. V'hu ke'inyan mni'at hakaza b'et shlitat ma'adim sha'adam roteach u'mitorer. Similarly, yeah, so, I didn't know that. I don't know if there are more babies in the full moon. Another example he gives: not only do the fluids of the world rise towards the moon when the moon is overhead, but when Mars is ascendant, the red planet, when Mars is ascendant, your blood warms. Everyone's blood is warmer when Mars is overhead. And since your blood is warmer, it wants to get out of the body. It's trying to get out of the body. And therefore, an injury when Mars is ascendant will be more serious than an injury when at other times of the day, at other times of the week, because if your blood is being heated by Mars, of course, you're going to bleed more if you have an injury. When Mars is ascendant, just like the tree is going to lose more sap if you prune off a branch when the moon is ascendant. Well, we're talking here about how to save yourself from injury, how to save yourself from damage, whether it's your own body or your tree. You want to protect the health of your tree, or you want to surely protect the health of your own body, so you don't want to run the risk of pruning the tree. When the moon is overhead, you don't want to run the risk of bleeding yourself. Back in those days, they would let blood out of the body as a medical therapy. You don't want to engage in the medical therapy of bleeding when Mars is ascendant. Zeh teva gamur. These are simple facts of nature, having nothing to do with idolatry, nothing to do with magic. There's nothing supernatural about this. These are simple facts of nature which HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which God imprinted into the universe when the universe was created. Einu ela ka'omer, this is no different than saying, Nash'eh davar zeh b'chatzi hayom k'sheh hashemesh b'tzigvaret chomo. This is no different than workers saying, let's delay our work in the fields. Let's delay our work building the house, whatever kind of workers you have. In midday, the sun is too strong it's too hot to work in the heat of midday. Let's move our work hours to later in the day, when it's not going to be so sunny, when the sun will not be so strong. Well, there's nothing magical about delaying work hours to the later afternoon because you don't want to work in the heat of the midday sun. There's nothing magical about that. There's nothing supernatural about that. It's a simple fact of nature that it's harder to work under the direct sun midday. If you live in a place like Israel in the summer, midday sun is very strong. Of course, you prefer to move your work hours earlier in the morning and later in the afternoon. Simple fact of nature, of course, the position of the sun influences us, and we sweat more, and it's harder to work under the hot midday sun. It's a simple fact of nature. The same has to do with the natural influence of the moon. The same is true regarding the natural influence of Mars and so forth and so on, as long as we are speaking not about magic, as long as we are speaking not about idolatry, as long as we're speaking about the facts of nature, the way the universe works, all is well, and of course, we will accept the verdicts of astrology, just like any rational person will not do heavy manual labor under the heat of the midday sun if he's able to move his work hours earlier or later. Similarly, no rational person will prune the tree when the moon is overhead, and no rational person will undergo bloodletting therapy when Mars is ascendant. The final words of the Meiri are as follows. This is the conclusion. But when the astrologers begin to talk about two different celestial bodies being in confluence, when they speak about the confluence, the joining together, the meeting of two celestial bodies in the same celestial house, כמו שיאמר שיוקח הדבר הפלוני בהיותו הירח במזל פלוני במעלה פלוני, like the astrologers constantly say, the best time to do such and such will be when the moon is in confluence with another star. Wait until these two celestial bodies have mutual influence together. Hikishef, that's magic, and that's prohibited. The confluence, the joining together of the influence of different celestial bodies means nothing. That has nothing to do with the rules of nature. That's pure magic, and therefore we reject that. What we do accept and what we do want, what we do like, are the simple facts of nature and not the idolatrous and not the magical elements of astrology. Kosher chavein asiyat pu'ula mi'inat pu'ula al zeh asur. Anyone who makes a decision what to do and what not to do based on magical considerations is guilty of a sin. It is prohibited to make your decisions about what you want to do or what you're not going to do on the basis of magic. One must make one's decisions about what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, on the basis of rational thought, and parts of astrology are exactly that. Parts of astrology are simply explaining to us the rules of nature, and of course, we are expected by God to lead our lives in accord with those rules, not in accord with the rules of idolatry and magic. Anyone who puts his faith, anyone who puts her trust in magic, anyone who places faith or trust in the idolatrous elements of astrology, that is a reduction. That is reducing trust in God, and that's no good. Tamim tihyeh im Hashem. We are expected to live our lives following the word of God, and part of that is to live in accord with the rules of nature, and certain elements in astrological wisdom are indeed in line with the rules of nature. Okay, so that's the end of the Meiri, and the Meiri has found a middle path. There are those rabbis who are full-fledged astrologers. There are those rabbis who are full-fledged opponents of astrology, and here we have a middle path. Both are right. Those who reject astrology are right. Those who embrace astrology are right. They're both right, and the reason that they can both be right is they're talking about different elements of astrology. There are certain elements in astrology which are valid, true, and correct, and of course, we embrace them. And there are other elements in astrology which are idolatrous, magical, and of course we reject them. Now, the same middle path is the middle path taken by the Meiri in so many other areas. And if you think about mystical movements which are popular in the modern world, exactly the same middle path can be applied to finding one's way in other mystical movements which are popular in the world today. Certain elements of those mystical movements might indeed be rooted in magic and idolatry, and those elements, of course, we reject. Other elements in those movements which might correspond with the truth of nature, the facts of nature, of course, we embrace those. That's the middle path of the Meiri. Now, we've seen those against, those in favor, and the middle path regarding astrology. Let's see if we can go a little bit deeper into understanding the logical underpinnings, the theoretical basis upon which all of this stands. There's a Mishnah in Masechet Avodah Zarah. Let's take a look at the Mishnah, and then we will see the way the great commentators, the way the great rabbis understand the Mishnah. These are the words of the Mishnah. Sha'alu et azkenim b'Roman. Back in late antiquity, the Romans thought of Eretz Yisrael as being a Roman province. Well, from their point of view, it was a Roman province. From the Jewish point of view, on the other hand, Italy, Rome and Italy, from the Jewish point of view, was a colony of Eretz Yisrael. That the Jews from Eretz Yisrael, including a number of Chachamim, including a number of great rabbis from those days, went from Eretz Yisrael to Italy. There was a Jewish community in Italy in late antiquity, in the days of the Roman Empire, and among the Chachamim, among the great scholars, the great rabbis of the Mishnah who lived in Rome, the Romans, non-Jewish Romans, the non-Jewish Romans asked the rabbis of the Mishnah, the rabbis who were living in Rome, Im ein ritzono ba'avodas kochavim. If God doesn't want us to do idolatry, the Romans were deep into idolatry. They were really idolaters. And the Romans asked the rabbis, you guys reject idolatry. If God is so much against idolatry, lama eino mevatla. Why does God not cancel? Why does God not nullify? Why does not God just put an end to idolatry? Your God is supposed to be omnipotent. Your God is, you say, is all-powerful. If your God is all-powerful and doesn't like idolatry, why doesn't he just put an end to it? That's the question which the Romans asked the rabbis. Amru lahem, the rabbis answered, Ilu ladavar she'ein tzarach la'olam hayu avdin. If the idolaters would be worshiping something that the world could live without, I am a vatlo, God would put an end to it. But in fact, the idolaters are worshiping the sun, the moon, the constellations, the stars. Just because they're fools, just because the idiots are worshiping the sun, that's a reason why God should take the sun out of the sky. Just because the idiots are worshiping the constellations, which have important influences upon us down here on Earth through the rules of nature. Does that mean God should take the stars out of the heavens? God is not going to destroy the world just because some foolish idolaters are worshiping natural elements of the world. Amru lahem, the Romans said again, if so, let God put an end to those idols which the world can survive without, and let God continue to allow the sun to exist. Let him just eliminate the statues of Zeus. Amru lahem, the rabbis responded, If God would put an end, would destroy only the statues of Zeus and leave the sun in the sky, that would only strengthen the hands of those idolaters who are worshiping the sun. The idolaters who are worshiping the sun would say, you see, God destroyed the statues of Zeus, but God did not destroy the sun. It must be that the sun is truly a deity. That is the Mishnah in Avodah Zarah. We're going to pause at this point. Next week, we'll see what the great rabbis learn from this Mishnah as far as the importance of the existence of the constellations, the stars, and the celestial bodies. Until then, I wish you a Shabbat Shalom and look forward to seeing you all again a week from tonight. Shalom, shalom.